Well, in this episode of The Party, I talked to you a little bit about my 4th of July celebration this year, and I also talked to you about some recent interactions I've had with Twitter and some apparent Twitter scams before we get into a review of Priscilla's role in a short-lived TV series on CBS called The American Girls. So stay tuned. Hello, and welcome once again to Frank Weber's Party. I'm your host, Frank Weber. So glad that you could join me once again today. So thankful for you for listening to the podcast and hitting subscribe. A few of you have even downloaded episodes, and so I'm really grateful to you for that. Please be aware that we also have a site where you can support the show financially if you feel so led. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is to give me some feedback regarding the show. I know we're still pretty early on. It would help me to really know what changes to make, maybe changes to the format, whether you think the content is right, whether you think it's bullshit, whether you think talking about Priscilla is bullshit, which I don't think it is, but it's supposed to be a show for you, and I'd love to hear from you in terms of how we could make it better. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things first, and then we're going to get into Priscilla's role in a very short-lived show called The American Girls that aired in the fall of 1978 on CBS. But before that, I wanted to tell you we just celebrated 4th of July here in Canyon. It's a big deal. We have a concert and we have a pancake breakfast and then a parade and a fair on the square and then fireworks. And it is a really big show and shindig and lots of fun. Always a blast going there, whether you live in Canyon or you're from nearby in Amarillo or some other place. It's always enjoyable. And so as I record this today, it's now July 5th. And for me, July 5th is sort of like the day after Christmas for a lot of people. Oh, well, it's over now, and that's it till next year. And actually, it's going to be a little while till our next really big holiday, which would be Labor Day, I think. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what 4th of July means to me. And also, particularly, we'll start off by talking about what it meant this year, because it's unusual when it happens in the middle of the week, especially on a Tuesday. My wife works a couple of hours out of town, travels back home for the weekends. She chose to stay at her town of work for 4th of July because it's not practical to go back and forth as much as it would have taken, especially having to work on Monday and then having to go back to work today on Wednesday, July the 5th. So she stayed there, and I spent the day by myself and went to some of the activities there in town. And it's interesting how people try to make it into a weekend the way the calendar falls. We're known in this country for 3-day weekends, but not 4 or 5-day weekends. And I don't know if that's a reflection of work attitudes today or just wanting extra time off. Next year, I think it's on a Thursday. With her schedule and my old schedule when I was working in dentistry, that would lead to a 4-day weekend, so it would probably work out better there. Of course, part of the problem, though, too, is having to stay up somewhat late to watch fireworks because it doesn't get dark till at least 9:45 or 10, and then you got to be back at work first thing in the morning. So that's one of the drawbacks to it, just depending on how the calendar falls. But regardless of what day it falls on, it's important to remember what it is still about in this country. And it's about freedom and independence from many things, all with responsibility, of course. And I could talk a lot about that, but I would tell you that my biggest thing is that this country gives us a lot of opportunities to do things that may not be possible in other countries. It usually requires a lot of hard work. There may be a lot of bumps in the road, lots of ups and downs. There may be even a failure or two, but failure is never final. You can learn from it and pick yourself up by the bootstraps and get up and do it again, and maybe talk to some people who can help you out. Generally, you can do pretty much anything you want to as long as you put your mind to it. There really isn't much you can't do. Now, I know there are a few notable exceptions. I'm 45 now, and I could not become a professional athlete at my age now. I don't have the body and physique for it either, but I couldn't do that now if I really wanted to. But there are many other things that I could get into, one of which is this podcast and writing a book, a novel, and grateful for those opportunities. So they are there. If you can work hard and find them, which you can find them, and just put your mind to it. And that's the thing that I'm really grateful about this 4th of July. And I'm just grateful to live in a country where we can do that. We can do lots of different things and have great holidays, great celebrations every so often, like the 4th of July. I'm just really thankful and grateful for that. And I hope you are too. And there are other things I could say about the holiday in our country. I think it's a good country. I do think that we are very unique in what we are able to provide for our citizens and myself and for you. I just wanted to tell you that real quick. And the second thing I wanted to get into, and hopefully this will be a little bit funnier and more comedic. I'm new, obviously, to podcasting, 6th episode now. I'm also pretty new to social media. And I'm always puzzled and taken aback by all the scams and craziness that sometimes happens on social media. I personally like Twitter the best out of all the social medias, I guess you could say, because there's a chance to have a real conversation about something that's really important there. Maybe even meet people and build relationships if that were a real possibility. I think it is. But there's just so much other junk and shit on there that doesn't always happen. And I'll give you a couple of cases in point here. The last month, I would follow a celebrity. I'm not going to say their names. There's actually 2 of them that I dealt with in June. But I would click on the celebrity, follow them, and shortly thereafter, they would come from what appeared to be a secondary account and follow me. And I'm like, I'm really flattered. This person is really following me. To be clear, it wasn't actually the celebrity, but somebody using their name and likeness and an account that looked like theirs to scam me. So I would follow back, and then there would be a little conversation going on the Twitter direct messaging, and we would actually build something of a relationship with each other, especially with the second celebrity that I was talking to, or I believed was a celebrity. And we'd build this nice relationship and talk to each other about our lives and everything. And eventually it would get to a point where they wanted into my bank account or my retirement account. And then I had to start blocking them and dropping the chat apps that I put on my phone because they wanted to go from the Twitter DM to a private chat app. Perhaps because the privacy would allow them to scam me, and then Twitter wouldn't have any knowledge of it, wouldn't be able to police them. I believe that's why they did it. But I didn't get scammed, ended it before it got to that point. It's a real shame, too. I know some of you are out there listening to me like, you're thinking that Frank is such a moron here, and why would I fall for that sort of stuff? But the issue here, as I was saying with Twitter, you have a chance for good conversations and relationships, and everybody has a real desire for connection, especially in this day and age. We got all this technology around and new ways to connect and meet people, and yet people are lonelier than ever. And these scam artists, especially using a celebrity's name and account, are trying to use that need and that desire to scam you out of a lot of money. And there's other scams too, prize scams. I think it's a shame that we see that in human nature. I wanted to warn you about that. I think there's a lot of good that can come through social media, and I can see how it can be useful, but people are always finding ways to get around that and try to use it for their own nefarious purposes. And I think the celebrities would be very mad that it was happening, because the real celebrities, it ruins their brands to have somebody scamming their fans. But I just wanted to share that story with you. I thought it was kind of funny. I don't really have a joke based on it, but that's what happened to me recently. And I haven't posted a lot. I've been on the social medias about 3 months and kind of been afraid to take control there and ask questions or make comments and so forth. And it's kind of a sad commentary. We have these things that are at our use that could be really good and really useful, and yet somehow they get perverted and misused, mistreated, and people are obviously upset and taken aback at that. I'm going to take a quick break right here, and then we're going to get into a review of The American Girls, so stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the show. We're going to get into Priscilla's appearance on a very short-lived, hour-long show on CBS called The American Girls. And some of you may be wondering, like, why am I spending any time on this? This wasn't a big show. After all, if you blinked, you would have missed the show. And I'm talking about it because this was actually the first show where Priscilla was part of the main cast, and she actually got top billing in the show. So I wanted to give that to you informatively. There were only 6 episodes that aired. They actually had filmed 11 of them. This episode that we're going to look at today is from September 23rd, 1978. This is the very first one, or the pilot, called The Canceled Czech. Czech being spelled like Czechoslovakia. The show was uploaded from a videotape onto YouTube by Ross Martin, or perhaps one of his family members, because I found out that Ross Martin died in 1981. He played Cusack in this show as a guest starred, and this is the only episode that's available. Really wish we could see more and review more, but if this is all we have, then we'll go ahead and review it. There's also another YouTube video promo, CBS promo, where Deborah Klinger, who's Priscilla's co-star in this, and Priscilla appear, and Deborah Klinger says, "Turn us on," meaning CBS, and then Priscilla goes, "And we'll turn you on." Definitely a late 70s-ish type of thing you would see on TV. And we'll go into why it was so short-lived and canceled after a short time. We'll probably go over that at the end. But the overview of the show is, it's essentially a Charlie's Angels type show, except in this case, you only have 2 women who are investigative reporters rather than trained as police officers or detectives. They work for a 60 Minutes type show. They don't carry any guns or weapons on them. It was really, in that regard, a little bit of a lighter show compared to Charlie's Angels. They travel around in a very equipped van with studio equipment. And they have a kind of a demanding boss who gives them the assignments and sometimes flies out to help them in their assignments. Going over some of the cast here, Priscilla plays a young reporter named Rebecca Tompkins, who doesn't really have a lot of experience reporting. She's really trying to get a desk job or a studio job. And then you have Deborah Klinger, who plays Amy Waddell, who's a very young reporter with reporting aspirations. Deborah Klinger was part of a group, an all-girl rock and roll band from 1966 to 71 called the Klingers. Those were with her sisters, I believe. And then as far as acting goes, she was also on the Croft Super Show on Saturday mornings in 1976 and 77. That was produced by Sid and Marty Krofft, who did things like Danger Island several years before. She was in a few other shows and movies. Brady Bunch Variety Hour, that was on not too long before this show. She was also in a movie called Midnight Madness that I wrongly thought was some kind of an early Porky's movie or something like that, and it wasn't that at all. It was actually a relatively family-friendly movie about college students that break up into groups and go on a scavenger hunt around town. And the movie's notable because it's Michael J. Fox's first movie appearance. Deborah Klinger, very pretty, very attractive. She had been in showbiz a little longer than Priscilla at this point. She looks a little like a cross between, I would say, Erin Gray from Buck Rogers and Silver Spoons and Cindy Williams from Laverne and Shirley. I don't know what happened to Deborah Klinger after the Midnight Madness movie. She kind of fell off the face of the earth, so to speak, but apparently hasn't done too much in Hollywood. She is apparently still alive. The next guy and other cast members, older cast members, of course, are no longer with us, but we have David Spielberg, who plays Francis or Frank X. Casey. He died a few years back. He's the executive producer of this program that the reporters work for called The American Report. He is no relation to Stephen, as you might be wondering, and he's from deep South Texas, right there by the Rio Grande, so I always think it's fun to have a fellow Texan in there. He was born in Weslaco and lived in Mercedes, so a couple of towns down there. He has several movie credits, was mostly a guest star on TV shows, though. Bob Urick's name keeps coming up on this show time and time again. He starred with Bob Urick on a 1973 risque sitcom based on the risque movie a few years before that called Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. That show was canceled within about 2 months. And then the only other regular star on this, he was barely in this show, this pilot that I reviewed, is a guy named William Prince, played by a guy named Jason Cook. He was in quite a few movies, some of which were with Clint Eastwood right around this time. Soap operas, guest starred on numerous TV shows. William Prince, as well as the guy who played Mr. Phillips, is no longer with us, as you might have surmised. I'm not really sure what part he played in this show. He seemed to be somebody ahead of Frank Casey, maybe a lower level boss, but he wasn't the main boss, as we'll get into this show. I don't think they even used his name in it. So now, the canceled check, the pilot episode, start watching this. The music is very newsy. It has that typewriter sound that they used to have in a lot of newsrooms, people typing in the background when Walter Cronkite or Sam Donaldson or Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw or something. They used to do that a lot back in the day, especially in that era. But they've added sort of a flute to the music to make it more of a primetime TV show and a little bit lighter hearted. And I'll try to give you a lead into the show here and try not to go into a lot of details, but there was some funny stuff in this show. A little bit of innuendo and double entendres, really pretty lighthearted stuff outside of Frank Casey being a demanding and firm boss. And I will tell you at the end that I thought that this show probably could have done better, and I'll give you one big example, maybe why it didn't. But the show opens with Amy, that's Deborah Klinger's character, remember? She was only a 21-year-old college student. She gets an exclusive interview with former President Nixon at his home. Now, it's 1978. I was a little young to remember this, but he had been out of office for 4 years, and I guess there was a time when he wasn't granting a lot of interviews in the years right after his resignation in Watergate. But somehow she was able to get it, and then there's some other reporters standing around wondering how she got it, and she says that's her secret. Some of the dirty-minded might have thought it had something to do with sex, but she reveals later that it wasn't. She got the interview by dressing up as someone from the gas company and requiring access to the house. So it sounds a little bit plain and not that creative for what it otherwise could have been, but that was how she got this interview with former President Nixon. The reporter suggested that reporters would give an eye tooth for this interview. And I'm like, yeah, they would give a canine to give this interview. That's an interesting quote to a guy like me who's a dentist by training. But the main subject of this show, there's a guy at a Reno hotel named Cusack, apparently a Czechoslovakian guy. And somebody from the American Report is trying to get an interview with him. I believe it's because he's a magician there and he's defected from Czechoslovakia. Of course, that was back in the day when Czechoslovakia was still an Eastern Bloc country, still under the rule of Soviet Union. And so there's a guy named Newman that tries to go up from the American Report and get an exclusive interview with him, but he throws a smoke bomb and disappears and winds up breaking the camera. And then Casey winds up firing Newman, and then Casey winds up having to go see his big boss, who I think his name is Mr. Phillips, who is always doesn't know that he's fired Newman and is asking why he doesn't hire this new girl, Amy Waddell. And he lies to his boss and says, oh yeah, I've hired her already or whatever. And he can tell he's kind of one of those guys, Casey is. And they try to get her on the phone and she was gone on a jog. And Priscilla's character, Rebecca, says, I hear jogging is really good for you. So Casey hires Amy on the spot there after a little small talk. And Amy really brown noses him and kisses his ass there. And at the same time, Rebecca, played by our lovely Priscilla Barnes, is disappointed at this hiring. She really wants to go do the story, get the scoop, and eventually have that desk gig doing the news. And she comes over and sits on Casey's desk and kind of shows her legs and says, I have certain assets that Newman doesn't have. And so there's a little sexy innuendo there. But Casey decides to send Rebecca out there to Reno to meet Amy, and they meet up and try to go get the story. Rebecca didn't know that Amy was going to be out there and equipped with the van already, in fact, which has a lot of cool toys like a CB and a mobile phone and police scanner and other things that reporters would typically have. And Amy didn't know at first that it was Rebecca's first assignment, and they get into that later. So shortly after this, Phillips, the big boss, finds out about two girls going on this magician story by themselves, and he's not happy with Casey. And obviously the implication is that Casey himself could get fired for that. But it just so happens, as it usually does in these episodes, that Cusack is auditioning for a new assistant that morning. And both of the girls, after some prodding, Amy goes ahead and auditions along with Rebecca. There's a couple other candidates that have kind of corny acts. And then Priscilla does a dance for her act. I thought she was pretty good at it. Priscilla was a dancer in some of the younger years. In fact, I think she even broke her leg once at the Hollywood Bowl, and I'm not sure what the production was on that. But she does a pretty decent dance, and then you have Amy come in and sing Olivia Newton-John's song, Let Me Be There. And turns out that Rebecca is hired to be Cusack's assistant. But of course, she was just dancing. She wasn't really planning on being an assistant, she says. I don't have any experience with that, but Cusack says the first time is the most exciting anyway. So you kind of can wonder about what he means by that. So from here, Rebecca, being his new assistant, allows her to get an interview with him. Cusack says first that, there's not to be any hanky-panky. I don't know if he's necessarily talking about sex there, but he may be talking about not asking certain questions, which is why he's been avoiding these questions anyway. And then you have Rebecca and Amy talking right before this supposed interview. And Amy says, well, it's against my religion to have sex in in exchange for information. Sex is supposed to be a reward for marriage. And of course, Rebecca's saying, I'm not doing anything like that. I'm just talking about getting friendly with them. We have, again, more innuendos there. But essentially what happens from then on, just to summarize from here on out, Rebecca goes in for the interview. These two bad guys who are near the van essentially chase them both, and they fall down the side, a pretty good side of a hill. It's all dirt. That's Rebecca and Cusack. They fall down the side of this hill. That's the most violent part of the show, quite honestly. And Priscilla does this really cute act, by the way, where Cusack puts her into a cage and makes her disappear, replaces her with a tiger, and then he makes her reappear during these initial scenes. That was very cute, very lighthearted. Anyway, an FBI guy shows up at the New York office of the American Report and tells Casey that these reporters are in grave danger. You should get them off the scene. And then Casey decides that he's going to fly out there and help them out. So Amy helps them out when they fall down the hill, and Cusack says, I'm not really hurt, and thought he'd broken his leg at first, but he's not really hurt. Amy tries to call the police after these guys on her mobile phone, which of course in the late 70s was a very cool thing. And they decide to go hide out at a different hotel in Reno, one that's a lot less swanky than the place that he's playing in. But the truth comes out about what he's doing. He has a family in Czechoslovakia trying to bring them over. He likes to bet on the ponies. And he's lying to them that he's not some kind of a spy. At one point, Amy asks him, are you a spy? He answers, do I look like James Bond? Which he doesn't look like James Bond, of course. But anyway, there goes into a thing where Amy winds up getting some airline tickets from the front cashier at this less than stellar hotel. And she bribes him with money. The guy says, oh, I'm a kind-hearted guy, and all that. And while Amy is out, Rebecca reveals to him that she works for the American Report, and then Cusack is very discouraged and alarmed by that. And then the two bad guys show up and they kidnap both of them and take them to this RV. And Amy meets up with Casey there. They wind up following this RV around, and Cusack winds up doing a little smoke bomb through the roof, and I believe uses Rebecca's scarf also as another signal to follow them. And of course, the police and the FBI are on them at this time, and they wind up getting out in the woods and run off the road through a little maneuver with another vehicle, and they wind up being arrested. Even Casey at one point got a little rough and physical with one of the bad guys, and it's kind of a comical scene there at the end. That's definitely worth a look. The whole thing was that even though Cusack had been a defector, he was actually a double agent. And this was a confusing part, but he was a double agent working for the U.S., selling apparently false information to Czechoslovakia at the time. We hear at the end, everything works out good. There's not really a big story on the news at the end to protect his privacy. Now, not only does he have his family, but he's moved to Vegas and is working at an even bigger show at this time with elephants. It was a fun little show. Like I said, it was just a pilot, so it was going to be a little bit rough on the edges. Usually they don't have the stories and the characters down pat. There's not always a lot of chemistry yet. But it was a very fun, very lighthearted show, and I enjoyed watching it. It's a time capsule into that earlier time, the late 70s, and you could have a very intriguing show that kept your attention without it being too violent or using a lot of weapons in this case. I didn't really understand how Cusack didn't get in trouble with at least the FBI for being a double agent. I guess it was because he worked for them. I'm not really sure. They didn't really explain that part. It's kind of like last week's show. I didn't understand how James Bond didn't go to jail after losing his license to kill. But for this episode of American Girls, I would give the overall episode an A-, and I would give Priscilla a grade of A. And so I really enjoyed it. And I think you should check it out on YouTube. I think it would be really worth a watch. I think you'll really enjoy it. Of course, that's the American Girls, the canceled Czech, as in Czechoslovakia, from September 23rd, 1978. Show ended November 11th of that year. I think it had a chance to do really well. Obviously, a little different take than Charlie's Angels. The premise seemed to be you had these reporters who were just trying to get the scoop on a story, and they wound up finding out that there was so much more involved to what they were doing. Obviously, some level of danger and danger to their lives. But the show was less violent than Charlie's Angels, and nobody died in this episode. There's a few people that died in Charlie's Angels, in fact. And it wouldn't be the first time that a show with potential was canceled because it was in a poor time slot. It was canceled because it was on Saturday nights on CBS, and it went up against The Love Boat, which was just in its second season then. Interestingly enough, because Priscilla had made her first appearance on The Love Boat in January of 78, and would make 2 more appearances later on that show. So, hope you enjoy that. I would check that out. I think it runs only about 47 minutes on YouTube. Very grateful to Ross Martin's family or his associate who put this up on YouTube. That's about it for today's podcast. Again, I'm so grateful that you've come to the party. Please continue to hit subscribe and tell your friends and family about us. I'm a little concerned about some of my metrics this week, but we really have only been available for about 2 weeks. But again, I love that you're listening or subscribing, even downloading if that's the way you choose to consume it. I really need to hear your feedback, hear where I take this show. And I would really implore you to do that through the means that I have listed on my show notes. But that's about it for the party. Thank you for being here, and look forward to seeing you once again next week. This is Frank Weber signing off. The theme song is called Retro Funk by SoulProdMusic and can be found at pixabay.com.